Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar today and sharing your morning or your afternoon with us. We're still waiting for folks to come in. I can see them joining, and I think we're admitting folks. So I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds, and then just going to start with a quick introduction as we've got a lot to cover on the call today. All right, let's go. Again, hello everyone. My name is Anita Dorette. I'm the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and really welcoming you here to join our webinar today, which we are co-hosting with Ranking Digital Rights. In fact, for the fourth year running, we've been working with Ranking Digital Rights and the data since 2019, and really have been, really am grateful for this partnership. Today's webinar, Data-Driven Investor Engagement with Tech Companies. We will be exploring and discussing the 2022 Big Tech Scorecard that has just come out, the latest assessment by Ranking Digital Rights as it relates to 14 of the world's most powerful digital platform companies on their policies, practices affecting people's rights to freedom of expression and privacy. Technology companies have responsibilities to respect human rights. Investors continue to urge companies to prioritize human rights protections in their policies, practices, and business models. This proxy season, shareholders have once again filed an unprecedented number of resolutions to put their concerns about human rights impacts of companies' operations to a vote. Well, what steps, if any, have companies taken to address these risks? But before we jump into the webinar proper, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to tell you about the Investor Alliance, which is an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR. We are a membership-based nonprofit initiative with over 200 members across 20 countries, representing over 10 trillion in assets under management. Our members include asset managers, private pension funds, trade union funds, foundations, and faith-based organizations. Our goal is to provide a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in the respect for people's fundamental rights, and we do this in one of three ways. First, to promote the investor responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct for institutional investors. We do this through webinars like these, where we try to, give data to investors so they're better able to engage with companies, which is really our second pillar. Corporate engagement, where we activate sort of broad base of investors to take a coordinated approach to engagement with companies. And we do this closely with civil society and experts in this area, just like Ranking Digital Rights. And the third is on standard setting, where we engage with policymakers and standard setting bodies to advocate for creating level playing fields that enable responsible business conduct. Before I kick off, just a quick bits of logistic points. First, we're recording this webinar, and the recording of the webinar will be made available to all registrants thereafter. Second, you're all muted at this time. And if you do have any questions, please put it into the question and answer box, or do raise your hand and we will try to see if we can unmute you, and you can ask your question when we open up for the Q&As. As you see on the screen today, we have today with us three great speakers. I'll take my time to, Jessica, we have Jessica Deer from Ranking Digital Rights, Jan Ridziak from Ranking Digital Rights as well, and Michaela Gregory from NEI. And so to kick us off, Jessica, the director of Ranking Digital Rights, and Jan, who is the company and investment engagement manager, is really going to tell us more about these findings. And so without sort of further ado, let me hand it over to Jessica and Jan to kick us off, and then we'll come back to Michaela a little bit later. Thank you.
Sure, I'm off mute. Thank you so much, Anita. It's wonderful to be here today. Thank you. One moment while I fix my screen. And thank you all so much for being here today and for your interest in our data. And thanks to the Investor Alliance for Human Rights for hosting us. I'm Jessica Deere, the Director of Ranking Digital Rights, and I'm here, as you know, with my colleague Jan Ridzak. And every year at Ranking Digital Rights, we try to make sense of an increasingly sort of complex array of company policies and practices and assess their potential impact for our fundamental rights to privacy and free expression, against a backdrop of world events that not only implicate, but are also influenced by corporate power and particularly tech power. And I just want to comment quickly on the title of this presentation, which is Light Years Away, which I think is a reference to sort of all the work that we still have to do, which I think you'll see after Jan presents some of the findings. If you can go to the next slide, please, Jan. Thanks. So Ranking Digital Rights, as you may know, evaluates the world's most powerful platforms, digital platforms, and telecommunications companies on their disclosed policies and practices affecting freedom of expression and privacy. And we do that using 58 different indicators, each with several sub-indicators in 3 different categories. Governance, we look at corporate governance, and we look at indicators related to freedom of expression, including content governance, and privacy, including both the protection of personal data and also security practices at companies. And if you can go to the next slide. And we're primarily focused on companies' transparencies about their policies and their practices. And so in essence, we link companies' poor transparency to real life harms. RDR's findings are sort of a barometer of how companies perform with respect to protecting human rights and a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, for future human rights failures. In 2022, we'll split our scorecard, or we were formerly known as the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index. And this year, we divided the index by digital platforms and telecommunications companies so that we could dive a little bit deeper into sort of the unique attributes vis-a-vis human rights of each type of company. Next slide, please. We'll say a little bit more about that. So our Big Tech Scorecard ranks 14 digital platforms every April. Our Telco Giant Scorecard will come out in November and rank the 12 largest telecommunications companies. And again, we have 58 indicators that encompass about 300 different standards on governance and free expression and information and privacy. Next slide, please. And so in creating these 2 scorecards to come out twice a year, we've also added and sort of expanded some of the highlights or aspects or attributes of the scorecards to allow readers to dive a little bit more deeply into the data, including we've expanded. We have one of the things that we have in the scorecard are individual company scorecards or report cards. So every company has its own scorecard or report card. And at the top of those, we have vastly expanded sort of the highlights and contextualized the performance and the position of those companies by looking at sort of what has transpired over the past year in terms of news and headlines, et cetera, to give an idea both of sort of what the position of the companies is vis-a-vis sort of a larger, like looking more sort of societally, and also to be able to sort of more explicitly identify what the harms are that that the company's policies or their lack of transparency around policies can sort of contribute to. We have also, because we are a data-driven organization and we're very hopeful and a lot of the work that we do is about getting others to use our data to support their own efforts, including investors and shareholders. And we've tried to improve our data explorer and we'll be enhancing it throughout the year. One particular aspect that I can point you to is there's a new section called lenses. that actually aggregates different indicators or indicators from across our different categories to try and give sort of a more focused look at specific issues. And we're beta testing that and its sort of utility for our stakeholders around algorithmic transparency and targeted advertising. And if you go on our menu to the Big Tech Scorecard and you select Data Explorer, you'll be able to find those. We've also included some additional metadata on our company report cards, including stock structure, which speaks very directly to Jan's recent piece on dual class shares and how they're harming shareholders' ability to have input into the governance of the companies that they own. And we've ranked new services this year, including LinkedIn, Siri, and Google Assistant, and a logo that I'm not familiar with. So, and we've also, another aspect of what we've done, we've been doing the scorecard or the index, our rankings, let's say, for this is our 6th edition of our rankings. And so we're starting to look at performance over time and how do companies' scores change over time and get sort of a longitudinal look at progress or decline. And we note, for those of you who are longtime RDR followers, we significantly updated our methodology in 2020 to add new indicators around targeted advertising and algorithmic systems. So there is a slight score adjustment there that should be taken into account. But we're really excited about this idea to sort of see how companies have improved over time. And so with that short introduction to what we do, I'm going to turn over the rest of the presentation to Jan, who will get into some of our favorite findings and just remind you that with a data set that gathers sort of so much information, hundreds of thousands of data points of policy around policy and practice for companies and their services, there are lots of other insights that you may find. And I encourage you to dive into the data yourself at rankingdigitalrights.org/index 2022. So Jan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And I'm really pleased to see all of you here and looking forward to the conversation as well. So this, as Jessica mentioned, is the 6th time that we are publishing this ranking, and it's also the 6th time that no digital platform has earned a passing grade, which for those of you who are less familiar with the US grading system is 60%. I should also add here that the final scores that you're seeing on the screen right now are an average of the governance, freedom of expression, and privacy categories. So as we say in our key findings essay, Twitter finished top of its class for the 2nd time in a row, but the entire class is still failing. So Twitter in particular owes its position to, in part at least, to relatively strong transparency on its content policies and good public data about how it enforces them. Something that certain purchasing parties should probably take into account. But even Twitter, as the top company, has what we could call disclosure deserts, right? We still saw no information from Twitter about how it handles data breaches. It's lagging behind pretty much all of its US rivals in human rights due diligence, and it's still unusually tight-lipped about its appeals mechanism, for example. Otherwise, you can see that the US companies still dominate the top half of the ranking, with Korea's Kakao tying Apple for 6th place right here. And then the Chinese and Russian companies that we rank alongside Samsung and Amazon, which I hope you can see on the screen at the bottom, round out the bottom half of the scorecard, with some of those companies posting pretty significant score improvements. There we go. Okay, so taken as a whole, the 14 companies that we ranked have improved marginally. I guess that's probably the fairest way to assess it. Yandex and Amazon posted the largest improvements overall. Yandex published its first transparency report this past year. It also appointed a chief privacy officer, and it offered some more clarity on how it enforces its ad policies. While Amazon improved on several aspects of governance and privacy in particular, which we'll get into in just a minute. Another trend here is that companies headquartered outside of the US once again made the biggest overall progress this year, though again, Amazon and Yahoo also took pretty notable steps forward as well. In addition to Yandex, the Chinese companies responded to looming regulations on issues like recommendation systems by bolstering some of their policies, although we actually saw less movement on that than we expected. A couple of additional things to note, Yahoo and Google were the only companies that declined slightly in the freedom of expression category, while Twitter and Meta were the only two companies with no improvements in the privacy category. Meta actually reported a slight net decline on giving users some more control over data collection and processing. But as you can very clearly see here, Google was the only company that had a decline overall, and it did so for the second year running. The reason why this has happened this year, at least, is that it let policies on content restrictions and encryption become outdated. In fact, last year, Google was also the only digital platform whose comparative score dipped. So I would say it's displaying a remarkable degree of consistency here. Largest improvements, as you can see, are on board governance. 8 companies improved on that. And I should say this is a longitudinal trend. Last year, we also saw a similar kind of improvement in the same category. Training and whistleblower protections also recorded a fairly large improvement, and some security indicators as well. So those are the main sort of categories of improvement. Now, let's take a minute to talk about Amazon. Amazon posted a respectable improvement by 4 points, and it also made progress in all 3 categories on more indicators than any other company. However, it's still founded at the bottom of the ranking, where it tied with Tencent for last place. Why? I think a lot of you will probably be asking yourselves that question. And the short answer here is that Amazon is still an outlier among its peers in the US. Its starting point from the previous year, which was the first time that we ranked Amazon, is very low. And as many of us know, bouncing up from the bottom is a journey that can take many years. Unfortunately, customers don't have years to burn when it comes to their rights and when their rights are at stake. So Amazon did bolster its transparency about things like management oversight of data privacy and a host of other issues. But its disclosures as they stand right now are still a far cry from what we would like to see. So like its counterparts in China, Amazon published no information, for instance, about government demands to censor content like product listings or customers' accounts. And that positions Amazon as a bit of an anomaly among US platforms. All of them, or all of the ones that we rank, have long since internalized the importance of this reporting. So that's definitely something that Amazon should remedy as soon as possible. Amazon also publishes very scant information about how it enforces its own policies to protect its users' safety and rights. And that means, what content it restricts, what rules that content breaches, what accounts it decides to terminate of its own accord. It is commendable that it reported that it had blocked about 6 million new accounts and 10 billion product listings. But again, let me emphasize, 10 billion. That is the kind of aggregate figure that must be unpacked, and RDR accounts for that kind of sort of vague not very concrete disclosure in our methodology. So overall, it's a step up from the total lack of disclosure on this issue last year, but it's really a drop in the ocean of the transparency needs that we have. And finally, as per the last point here, Amazon's virtual assistant, Alexa, is in the same league as its counterparts at Alibaba, rather than competitors like Google Assistant and Apple Siri. So overall, we strongly encourage shareholders to work with us including on resolutions seeking to expand transparency on all of these topics. And that's because the harms of this kind of opacity, or the harms that this kind of opacity generates, are real. And their contours, we believe, will only become clearer as Amazon pursues its advertising ambitions further. A couple of months ago, Amazon revealed for the first time that its revenue from advertising amounted to approximately $31 billion, which makes advertising Amazon's 3rd largest source of sales. So now, alongside Google and Meta, Amazon essentially forms a triopoly that accounts for the majority of digital ad revenue in the US. It has no major competitors waiting in the wings, so its growth in this market really has to be paired with a responsible approach to freedom of expression and privacy. Speaking of advertising, advertising as a whole is still at the heart of big tech's business model, and that creates both enormous risks and high expectations from programs like ours of transparency. For the second year in a row, we noted that none of the 14 companies that we rank earned more than 50% of the possible points on our targeted advertising indicators, and not a single company has announced a comprehensive human rights impact assessment of the mechanisms that it uses to tailor ads to its users. Additionally, we know from our own research that among the industry's leaders, there is little to no transparency about, or transparency reporting rather, about ad policy enforcements. And that means things like how many bad ads companies take down, how many they stop in their tracks, how they deal with violations of targeting rules, what kind of technologies and methods are used. So this year featured no improvement on this at all, except at one company, which is Yandex. So Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Baidu all publish some data about this, but only in selected categories. So it's really more of a sampler than the full experience, so to speak. And I would single out Meta in particular here. Meta still discloses nothing about this. It is one of the largest ad companies in the world, accounting for more than a quarter of US digital ad spend, which is second only to Google. And it is very, again, anomalous and strange to see that Meta is not publishing any transparency reporting on this front. Our colleague, Dr. Natalie Marischal, who's RDR's policy director, makes a really compelling argument in one of the companion pieces to the scorecard that companies will continue to linger in this lack of disclosure unless and until advertising is regulated. So I encourage all of you to dive into that. So a couple of words about company engagement here. RDR's process is really at its most fruitful when companies recognize that they have a long way to go. But to arrive at that recognition, they really have to internalize that exposing their shortcomings can ultimately make them stronger. And that's not just by giving them a clear sense of what needs work as far as policies are concerned, but also by galvanizing human rights champions inside the company, giving them an independent tool to sort of wave in front of leadership and show this is a priority. And we are behind the competition on a lot of aspects that relate to the protection of human rights. And then they also have to engage in dialogue. And the critical moment at which this dialogue happens for us is when we send every company a full set of preliminary results, which is several months ahead of publication, and we give them the opportunity to address them. So when their arguments and evidence are persuasive enough to us, we review those preliminary findings and update the results. So this year, all but a handful of the 14 companies provided this feedback. And I should say that every single company that offered that feedback ended up with at least a slightly improved final score. There were 4 companies that did not address their draft results at all, and that was the 3 Chinese companies, the 3 Chinese platforms, Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, as well as Google. So, and on an overarching note, we are used to the sound of silence from that first cohort. Our research analyst, Jia Zhang, argues in another piece that is published with the scorecard that lack of engagement with human rights groups is really a deliberate tactic on the part of Chinese tech companies. But Google is really a perplexing companion to those companies. And frankly, it's a little disappointing that we haven't seen more communication on Google's part. So this year, we have also taken up a lot of work with the investor community, first by providing insight from our research findings, and not just a snapshot of how companies are doing, but also how they compare, how they have evolved over time, and also a sense of where their actual deeds have diverged from their declarations, so to speak. We also work with coalitions like the Investor Alliance. I think the Investor Alliance is really the shining example of our work with coalitions. And I should highlight in particular, I know Anita will probably talk about this at the end of this webinar, but in particular, I would like to highlight the work that flows from the Investor Statement on Corporate Accountability for Digital Rights, which has been very fruitful and very productive. We also participate actively in standard setting processes like SASB's, which is building out, for those of you who don't know, is building out its guidance on content governance and privacy standards. We're exploring options to syndicate our data to ESG platforms that can combine it with other data that might be relevant. And last but not least, we work closely with the Alliance to collaborate directly with shareholders in conceptualizing and also designing resolutions that target core digital rights issues. This year, we partnered with Mercy Investment Services, NEI, and Share on 2 resolutions that asked Meta and Alphabet to conduct and publish a human rights impact assessment of both their existing targeted advertising systems in the case of Meta and their future targeted advertising systems in the case of Google/Alphabet. One of those, the Meta resolution, is going to a vote this month. Maybe Michaela can talk a little bit more about that. And then the other helped pressure Google into abandoning its plans to develop what we see as a deeply problematic new system to target users with ads. There are dozens of other resolutions that align with our standards, and we encourage all shareholders to reach out so we can help orient your proposals so as to reach your peers and vote on these issues ultimately. And of course, the main problem with the proposals at both Meta and Alphabet is that we know that both of them will be torpedoed by leadership because both companies have dual class share structures in place that essentially concentrate power in the hands of their respective founders. We believe that the surge of multi-class tech IPOs creates a risk of severe human rights impacts. Founders are essentially securing their place in the sandbox while shutting out shareholders and the broader public, shifting the risks of their failures and their dereliction to society. This, in our opinion, entrenches not just toxic leadership, but the business models that leadership can produce and perpetuate. And we believe that tech has too much societal impact to really have a single point of failure in that way. We believe multi-class share structures should be eliminated entirely, but in the meantime, we can cross the bridges that will get us there, like imposing sunset clauses. And in pursuit of that goal, we have published a piece, as Jessica alluded to before, that lays out the argument against dual class shares. And we're actively rallying support around both a civil society letter and an investor letter to the SEC to generate pressure on lawmakers to curb these structures. We encourage you all to reach out if that resonates with you. So to wrap up, in many ways, the hype around big tech's transformative qualities has weakened. Shareholders, governments, users still recognize the benefits that these platforms can bring. I think many of us still, recognize that they are important to maintain and build out connections between people, societies, and communities. But they also have become ever more aware of their shortcomings and their impact. I would say that what distinguishes these companies now is not the prowess with which they will take us into the metaverse or the next big thing, but their ability to demonstrate that they are responsible stewards of users' data and of users' rights. So we believe it behooves us all to pursue these goals, the goals that you see in front of you, if we want to see a healthier internet, to band together to curb the use of lopsided share structures without shying away from recommending regulatory action, to keep a focus on ad tech and the perils that it brings, which manifest themselves often in very subtle ways, and to consider the way that companies' operations affect users around the world. RDR is greatly expanding its work with civil society partners in several countries to examine new companies and industries, and thus enhance our own understanding and the public's understanding of how individual communities are affected by companies' operations. And last but not least, we have to recognize collectively that poor governance is where it all begins. So we are watching closely what happens to policies when a company goes through a major shift in structure and a major shift in ownership. And that is certainly not a sub-truth. So with that, thank you very much for listening. And we look forward to your questions and welcome your feedback.
Thanks so much for that, Jan. I think it was a very interesting presentation. I think that the new sort of data set and the access to that data, I was playing with it over the week, really provides a way to look at data sort of comparatively. And so really looking forward to delving deeper into finding out more about that data and how to use that. And, you raising the issues that investors have been grappling with and trying to engage with companies on over business models using targeted or surveillance-based advertising really goes to the core of that. And so really wanted to thank you for running through that. Very fortunate to partner with the two of you. But what we want to do now is to really get a flavor of how investors have been working with this data. And we have today Michelle Gregory, who's the Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Services at NEI Investment. Michaela spearheads dialogues with companies across a number of sectors, including the tech sector, and including on the digital rights issues. So I'm Michaela's also a member of the Advisory Council of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. And so, great partner and collaborator with us, and really looking forward to the sharing that Michaela will be providing today as we learn more about how NEI's work on digital rights has been enabled through this sort of data-driven engagement with tech companies. So with that, Michaela, over to you. And just quickly, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We see a few in there already. After we hear from Michaela, we'll jump into Q&A. So really looking forward to that discussion. Thanks, and Michaela, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Anita, and it's really great to be here with all of you today. Also really happy to share how helpful and how much of a great input the RDR Index and the RDR team has been in terms of advancing our work on digital rights with companies in the tech sector. And so I think to start off, given all the great insights that Jan has shared and Jessica has introduced, what we found to be really helpful is just the level at which the index helps us to keep informed on issues where data right now is far from standard and consistently reported. It's one of the few resources where we can really readily have the information that we need and have it in a way that we're able to look at it across companies in a comparable sense. And even more useful when we know that data is still evolving when it comes on to digital rights issues. So I am also really energized to hear that RDR has been considering ways to share and help lean into supporting the direction of these conversations right now on what standardized data should look like. So that's exciting to hear. I think also more substantively, it's really helpful to get a sense of the strengths of companies, of their approaches, and of course, their areas of improvement. But more broadly, what I really appreciate is also the ability to gain insights on industry needs and where the industry is overall, particularly as we are at a place where we don't necessarily have that policy on a global basis. We're getting there. There have been policy changes. But that said, we know that there is a lot of room for improvement for the industry overall. And I found that the index really makes things tangible for investors who may not necessarily always have that technical expertise, right? So that's the first prong, really keeping informed, that then runs into helping us with our engagement strategies. It's a useful tool, and Jan has commented already on the investor statement on corporate accountability for digital rights at this point, and Anita and others from the Investor Alliance can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have at least 88 investors and upwards of $9 trillion in assets under management and stewardship who have signed on to that statement, which really leans on the RDR index and the insights and information that we glean from that statement in really targeting companies for engagement and in terms of how we can improve, how they can improve. And this has been ongoing now for years. I think we started this in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, Anita, right? And so it continues, that relationship continues to be exceedingly useful in terms of really being able to zero in on the issues with companies. I find that the index gives us something that allows us to wrap our hands around the specifics of the issues, without necessarily getting caught up in, so to speak, the frills of what the company would like to present as a state of play regarding internal processes and policies. And so that's exceedingly helpful. And us at NEI, we have leaned into the engagements as part of that statement, but we've also leaned into using the index through other small group engagements as well to advance and to continue to advance these dialogues with companies across the SCT space. And Jan also alluded to the idea of escalation. And so I think that's the third piece. And that lends itself well to just speaking about the broader and ongoing support of the RDR team in allowing us to really maneuver a landscape that is changing very rapidly, where, in the context of the Meta proposal, for example, it's really important for us to have a better sense of how things are shifting in a policy landscape. And the team has been so helpful in getting us quickly up to speed on those issues so that we can be ready to pivot and escalate an engagement depending on the nature of the conversations that we're having with companies. And so I'll stop there. Those 3 points, I think, really sum up the immense value of the relationship that the RDR team has with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and what that means for us as investors who do our best to lean into the opportunities of engagement that the Investor Alliance for Human Rights facilitates. So thank you, and I will turn it back to Anita.
No, thanks so much for that, Michaela. And I think you're being far too modest, and the investor community and the work that you've been leading together with many of the members of the Investor Alliance and the investor community as a whole have really wanted to engage with tech companies, and with the data that is available, that really allows us to have conversations where we can kind of refer back to that data to really deepen those conversations, as you mentioned, Michaela. And one of the things that we try to do within our engagement group is really to try to figure out, how do we deepen that engagement? What kind of questions do we need to ask to really pull out from companies, really gain their insights as to how much they are really meaningfully addressing human rights harms, the rights to privacy, the rights to free expression. So, so thanks for that sharing. And we have quite a few questions in the box. Some of them are fairly topical. So I'm going to kind of, take a few of the general ones first, and then kind of wrap up with a bit more sort of the topical answers sort of later. I wanted to ask you, I'm going to take this question on targeted advertising, since we've been kind of speaking about that and how that really goes to the, to the core of a lot of the platform companies, and now even Amazon as well, based on the disclosure that they have just made. So I guess my question is there a way that targeted advertising can continue that doesn't harm human rights? And what impacts would changing that business model have on the profitability of digital platforms? Happy to throw this out to anyone to kind of take that.
Jan, you or I, you want to start and I can fill in, or sure. Or and Megan also, it sounds like you're going to answer. I can't tell. Okay.
Sorry, I'm happy to take the first stab at that that
Great.
question. Yeah, sure. So a couple of things. So first of all, I think it is we will be closely observing the trajectory of the legislative action that is taking place in the EU, the DSA and DMA in particular. Most recently, we have there's a very important point in the current draft of the Digital Services Act, which covers a ban essentially on sensitive categories that would not be for which targeted advertising would not be applicable. That includes advertising that would be targeted towards children. right? So that is a start, not necessarily the final sort of waypoint on this road, but that is banning sensitive categories from being targeted to is certainly a step in the road. But there's also a sort of higher level concern here, right? Which is that the aggregation of data is at the heart of all of this, right? It's not just about some specific categories that are pre-identified, but categories that can be sort of through correlation constructed by targeted advertising systems, right? So it's not enough to just say you cannot target your ads towards children, because ultimately through inference and other means and combining different sources of data, that can still be the outcome, right? So the intention can be there to not target ads towards children, but the outcome might still be harmful, right? So that is the level at which we want to operate, and extending, legislative action, regulatory action to issues like data inference, to combining different sources of data, direct purchases from data brokers. That is really sort of at the heart of where we want this to go. So I don't know if Jessica has any additional color she wants to add on that.
Sure. I mean, I think all of that, and I think what we also have to acknowledge is that one of the reasons why we're not sure, and I would say we don't know exactly what the way is to target advertising that doesn't harm human rights. Although, well, let me start with targeted advertising. Existed before the internet. There's other ways of targeting advertising in terms of geographical location, things that are not so highly personal. And that what makes targeted advertising online so pernicious is that it's it's behavioral. It's about companies collecting how you behave and interact with their sites. It's also about optimizing what happens between sort of the creation or before collecting that data and creating categories that then you're targeted into. But the worst part about all of it is that we don't know exactly what they're doing. And so this is why RDR focuses on transparency. We don't measure performance. And so, which is just to answer a couple of the other questions.
Do we lose Jessica?
What it is they do. We measure what is it that they say that they do as sort of a best case scenario for understanding what they might do. We cannot do all of that reconciliation about are they actually doing what they say they do, because we don't have enough information. And this goes to the point of Jan's note earlier with the targeted advertising and the lens sort of view that I was speaking of, where we're not getting nearly enough information from the companies. They're not even telling us what they do. And so it's very difficult to understand what could be done differently. Although, contextual advertising has been successful, targeted advertising without so much sensitive data has been successful. And I think, one of the points in Natalie's essay is about ad tech is really about sort of, ad databases and transparency in what ads are being run and how companies are enforcing their targeted advertising policies. We have next to no data on any of that. If we knew more about it, we would know more where the problems were so that we could actually formulate some better solutions.
Thanks for that, Jessica. And Michaela, were you going to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I think Jessica actually started tackling it, right? I think before we can ask the question of whether or not there's what the broader implication is of how companies can do targeted advertising in a rights respecting way, I think the first thing we need to know is what are they doing, right? And are they actually implementing processes and adequate due diligence to ensure that they're mitigating human rights harms? I think there is a pre-conversation to the conversation that they're not letting us adequately have. And that's why, I think we co-sign on the need for human rights impact assessments and other such means of human rights due diligence to give us some insight into actually what are the risks and actually can those risks be fully mitigated. But clearly, there is a lot of resistance to having those conversations. And I think that's the first hurdle that we need to get past.
And in the context of disclosure as well, which is what the data that we need. I mean, I think that when we're in conversation with companies, a lot of times they will say that they're not able to disclose this data because it compromises their competitive position, or that it jeopardizes shareholder returns. But of course, shareholders are asking these questions because we're looking at long-term value. So just a quick question in terms of how can we counteract these responses from the companies so that we can really get answers into this? Is this really competitive data, or is this really sort of, or how can they disclose it in a way that doesn't breach those competitive concerns, but really provide some meaningful insights on human rights protections?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting question, Anita, and I think whilst there may be some legitimacy to that point, I don't think that companies have done much to try to cross that hurdle. And I think right now the door has been fairly closed. The conversations have been quite limited, and there needs to be some attempt to figure out how do we do this in a way that still addresses perhaps some of those concerns, but also lets stakeholders in more broadly into issues that have far-reaching impacts on society. So I think there are limits to how far and how much we can actually accept that argument without actually seeing some tangible effort on the part of companies to do better on the transparency front.
Yeah, no, and thanks for that. And I was just noting that the Digital Services Act that has kind of just sort of been agreed on talks about tech companies sharing that data, which is considered to be maybe confidential or competitive, with academics on a
Right.
and as opposed to maybe sort of the broader market, so that academics and other sort of civil society organizations can really dig into that to come up with sort of more general recommendations. So that's one thing to think about, because often enough in these conversations as well, we're trying to get to that root of that problem. But happy for any suggestions as we go forward. Yeah.
No, I think that's an interesting point too, Anita. And I mean, there are other platforms where companies get together and discuss industry-wide issues, right? And so I think this is another issue where they should be working together from an industry-wide perspective to determine what the solutions are. And if that's possible across other sensitive areas of company performance, I think that's definitely possible here. And companies have shown, even through the GNI, that they're willing to do that in some respect. So there's definitely scope to do that when it comes on to targeted advertisement.
Great. No, thanks for that. I'm going to move to some other questions. Some topical questions have come in relating to Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. And so there are some questions on, how is this going to impact Twitter's ranking of Twitter going forward? Are there any sort of predictions about what this means with Twitter really ranking at the top for, many, the previous years and this year as well?
I'll start this time, Jan, if you want, and then you can fill in. So I think it's interesting. One aside is I think it's interesting how much focus there is on Elon Musk being a billionaire owner of Twitter, when this isn't really a departure from the norm. Mark Zuckerberg and others, it's maybe different because it's a purchase, but this is the status quo. And we need to recognize that. I also want to say, based on what Elon Musk has said about what he wants to do with Twitter, it doesn't sound like Twitter, it sounds like Twitter may not be will very likely not be as good of a place to interact. For RDR's ranking, again, it's really going to depend on how much transparency there is in the policies that emerge once the shift in ownership is finalized. And because, again, we evaluate how transparent they are. So there's a very real scenario that they're very transparent about their policies, and that the policy is that there will be no content moderation. we'll certainly rank that according to our indicators and sort of see where we end up and, evaluate it like other platforms. But I'll also say that by taking Twitter private, we're sort of trying to figure out, and Jan can speak a little bit more to this because I think you've thought about it more. When we first developed our criteria for what companies we evaluate, we decided that they should be publicly held companies because they are held to higher disclosure standards. We've now seen in the last year Apollo Management Group buying Yahoo, and we're seeing the privatization of Twitter. And so we're starting to grapple with what exactly are the implications for privately held companies in our particular research. So, that's not a very direct answer to the question, but being a research organization is very difficult for us to anticipate what's going to happen without data and without understanding exactly what has been made transparent. Obviously, for the overall environment, I think we're aligned with many of the observations that less content moderation, particularly at a platform that has made so many positive strides in how they've moderated content and places at the top of our ranking specifically because they have been transparent about that. We're concerned. But again, we will measure the transparency of the policy rather than or primarily to evaluate, are they being transparent enough? And if they are, then we will have good information about what the harms, the related harms may be.
And Jessica, I think you did a great job on giving that overview, and I think you did really answer that question. So I'm going to kind of move on to take, because we've got quite a few questions, and this is another one that's pretty topical. How is RDR dealing with alleged censorship of the Russian-Ukraine war? For example, there are several reports of suppression of Ukraine war information for Russian internet users at Yandex and at VK mail.ru. Maybe Jan, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first component here to the response would be, if you look through our report cards, we have taken care to embed some information about how individual companies have responded to the invasion. And Yandex and VK are no exception, but that also extends to companies that have some operations in Russia or Ukraine, or however tenuous or indirect the connections may be. So I think overall, so tech platforms have reacted in many different ways. Some have ceased operations, some have scaled down parts of their operations, some have opted to cut off the Russian mouthpieces of the Russian government, or cutting off cutting off advertising revenue. To us, that last part is probably the most promising approach, because it also speaks to it leaves users with the sort of least impact, or impacts users the least. But I think overall we do have to be cognizant of the fact that blocking of accounts, blocking of content, that's not a panacea. It does not solve the problem. Right? The problem lies in the so-called engine of the platform, as Katarzyna Szymilewicz from Panopticon Foundation said in our launch event yesterday. So certainly, the solution is not to conduct wholesale blocking of communication platforms. That, I think, is something that all of civil society virtually agrees with. But we do just have to be aware of the fact that it is still a business model issue, and we also have to be vigilant about the consequences of deciding to keep investing or divest from Russia as a market. For example, one of the largest investors in BK, which is drifting ever closer to the government, was Prosus, which is one of the largest tech investors in the world. A few weeks ago, Prosus announced that it would sell off its stake in VK, and that virtually leaves VK mostly in the hands of Vladimir Putin and his closest associates. So that creates a pliant social media platform that can be at the behest of a dictator at any moment. So that leverage that investors had over a company like that is gone. That is something that we should be amplifying, and a sort of threat vector that others should be aware of as well.
No, great, thanks. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to throw out kind of two questions, and they're pretty big questions. So I'm see whether you can do this. So one of the issues relates to regulation. I think there are questions around growing regulation in Europe, requirements for transparency, and whether, ask questions around what kind of potential regulations should there be around wearable devices. So, really, is regulation likely to create the much needed improvement that we're talking about? So that's kind of one question. And then the second question I wanted to ask goes to the question of remedy. I mean, we've talked about enough times about how, that there is really a need for tech companies to provide access to remedy. How can shareholders prioritize their engagements to ensure such access to remedy, and what expectations should we raise with companies to improve that? So if you can kind of try and take those two questions, and then we'll hopefully just leave 1 minute at the end to wrap up. Sorry, that not too much time.
I will very quickly just chime in on the issue of regulation, and the way that you framed it, Anita, was very kind, in the sense that, yes, I do think regulation will have an impact. I think the degree of the impact will depend, but primarily because it shifts the burden of these negative externalities that we're facing from the people, from the users of the platforms, to the government who needs to enforce the regulations, and to the companies that need to comply with it. I think, there's a wide range of different types of regulation and aspects of regulation that are being debated. I'm certainly not an expert on the regulation of the DMA and the DSA yet, but I think there are many provisions there that are definitely about safeguarding rights. Certainly it's flawed. I think also there's a lot of regulation. There are flaws also, but certainly there's also, regulation that's coming through Congress, and it will depend, I think, on sort of what happens, how quickly things can happen here in the US, to what degree the regulation actually has an impact. But I think enforcement of the regulation is a really key part of it. And I think we've seen some challenges with the GDPR in those terms. And so trying to get that right makes a lot of sense. In terms of remedy, I don't know, Jan, are you closer to that piece, and can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So I think remedy also has different sort of facets and different faces depending on the company that we're talking about, right? We have indicators that specifically refer to remedy in the context of appeals, for example, where content moderation appeals, where companies generally tend to perform pretty poorly. They tend to say very little about what degree of remedy, what kinds of remedy they offer in the form of appeals. And that is something that they haven't been compelled to improve so far. But I would say that on a overarching point, and I know we have just a couple of minutes left, but I want to sort of double down and reemphasize Jessica's point about the importance of tracking compliance and ensuring compliance, but also ensuring that companies apply improvements not just in the jurisdictions where they're forced to be better, but also in other parts of the world, right? Whether it's in the EU or in California, which has the strongest privacy protection system in the US, we want to see those kinds of protections extended across the world, and not necessarily just one jurisdiction. And if that already applies, which some companies tell us that they do apply those protections globally, then that has to be very explicit. Right? We cannot just take them at their word. So just keeping that global perspective in mind is just incredibly important at this moment.
Thanks for that, Jan, and thanks, Jessica. Just to sort of, I want to take the opportunity to thank Jan, Jessica, and Michaela for taking the time to really engage with shareholders, provide this data, and with Michaela to provide those insights into how those data are used, some of the challenges that they face, but really some of the ways that we've really been able to bring that together. And the issue is really this partnership. And I would ask all of you to, or ask those on the call, investors on the call, if you're interested in learning learning more about this, learning more about how tech companies are performing, how you want to engage companies on this, please join our collective engagement initiative that we had that, Michaela as well referred to, where we're engaging with the 26 companies that Ranking Digital Rights assesses in their index. And part of that is setting out the expectations of investors, of companies, and we've done that in the investor statement on corporate accountability. Both Jan and Michaela mentioned that, and putting those down really kind of lays down the gauntlet at companies and gives us a basis for continuing that engagement. And I wanted to thank all the investors, many of whom are on the call as well, for that work in really taking the time to engage with companies on that. And as we engage with companies, I mean, using the data is a critical part, but also sort of building the understanding on the salient issues that arise from these from services that are offered, whether it's wearables, whether it's the new metaverse that's coming into play, and all the information we're asking. We've also created some tools that kind of really go into understanding what are the ICT salient issues briefs specifically for investors, and we touch on topics like privacy, conflict and security, political participation, and we have a new one coming out in a couple of weeks and months, maybe on a couple of weeks, I would reckon, on child rights. So with that, I wanted to say, well, we're getting into proxy season. Vote your proxies this year. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to Megan or to Jan and Jessica. And we'll be happy to, figure out how we can, really together use our investor leverage to drive for this change and more sort of right respecting behaviors. So thank you everyone for joining the call today. And thanks then. Bye-bye.